And welcome back to Frankly Speaking. I'm your host, Frank. So, oftentimes I get the question from friends of mine about Benito Mussolini because they know I've been studying Italian history now for a while, particularly fascist Italy and Mussolini himself a lot, trying to get a more nuanced understanding of history. And here's what I'll say about that. As my curiosity in the topic began about actually right after the 2020 election here in America when Joe Biden was elected president of the United States. Because I began to see some disturbing patterns actually on the political right who were licking their wounds and trying to figure out what had happened. And all of a sudden now, with corporate entities turning to the far left, which ironically enough, the corporations were, they were big on the political right or supported by the political right for as long as I was in the conservative movement. For decades and decades and decades, the political right championed and praised corporations and big business, protected them politically. It was part of the larger, grander debates between the left and the right when I was in the conservative movement all the way up until right around 2013. And then even after that, the political right continues to protect corporations. And we always had this sort of left and right divide, big corporations versus, again, labor in this country, the left defending labor, the right defending big business and the rights to make profits and things of that nature. And I thought it was interesting after the 2020 election when the corporations began to play such a vital role in helping the left win in America that the right now felt betrayed. And it was interesting because from my perspective, when I started to deviate away from conservatism, right, this classical liberal ideology, which I kind of give sort of an official time span was in 2013 is when I left, right after the election of Barack Obama, because I began to see some fundamental flaws in the political right. I thought it was interesting that they would take the position that all of a sudden now they were screaming and yelling fascism, right? The fascism has arisen in America because of the collusion between big business and the government. This is how the right saw it after 2020. And you still see it on right-wing talk radio, like of Dinesh D'Souza and a few others screaming fascism all the time because of this collusion. And I found that interesting because I remember going all the way back to at least 2013 when I began to question what was going on the political right. The question I was asking was, what stops these corporate interests from monopolizing the markets and essentially creating monopolies and ultimately oligarchies? And that's a question that the political right never wants to deal with because their answer is, well, the markets are the gold standard. The markets always create this equilibrium that presents a certain level of fairness in the market. And of course, that's not what we've seen. What we've seen is that the oligarchs, corporations, same thing, whatever you want to call them, have risen. They've accumulated power. They've accumulated land. They've consolidated shares of the market. They've destroyed smaller businesses. They've become wealthy beyond all means, and then they collude with government. And all of a sudden now the right, for decades and decades and decades and being in collusion, or at least being allies with corporations, have now found that they were screwed, and in desperation and in feeling betrayed, they start screaming fascism all of a sudden. And that's where my curiosity in fascism actually peaked. And while I don't consider myself an expert on this in any kind of way, it's something that I've taken a deep study into, and I'll take a crack at it, and you could take it for what it's worth. But it was a strange phenomenon that rose in the political right, because as I've said, what we have in America today is not fascism. When you look at what corporations have done with their lives with government, but we have what actually many integralists and distributists and Catholics have said for at least a century. What we have is oligarchical rule, right? Even if we go back to the basic philosophical principles of the ancient philosophers. What we've known is that you always needed a monarch to protect the lower classes from the aristocracy. While in America, we've convinced ourselves we don't have these social status or these class structures because of democracy and freedom and liberty and all that stuff. Well, we do have those structures, right? But what we don't have is an authoritarian form of government to protect, again, the peasant class from this aristocracy of sorts that has risen through corporations and elites and things of that nature. And this is what the right doesn't see. They're absolutely blind to this fact. And so in desperation after that election, they began to scream out fascism, fascism, fascism. And to be honest with you, because I'm of Italian descent, I knew there was a problem with it. And I began a big deep dive into Benito Mussolini and Italian fascism. And so the question I get all the time from people that know I study this idea of fascism, and particularly sort of the biography of Benito Mussolini, is, was Mussolini the bad guy? Or was he a good guy, or was he a bad guy? Effectively, is what I'm being asked. Because if you look at the time, Mussolini was admired by many people, particularly here in America. And in many ways, Mussolini admired America, especially praising it for its ingenuity, its spirit of ingenuity. And that's the question that always comes up in many ways. And what I'll say is this, I'll answer it this way, because what the problem, of course, with Mussolini is, of course, the alliance with the failed Austrian painter, which history will always condemn him for that alliance, and maybe rightfully so, right? Because whatever you may think of Mussolini, whether he was a good guy or a bad guy, that alliance was a terrible mistake at the end of the day. Now, I don't want to get into that alliance because there's a lot of nuance there and a lot of macro foreign politics at the time, you know? But whatever you may think, he will always be condemned for that. And again, rightfully so, probably, right? But as far as Mussolini himself, why did he rise? Was he a good guy? Was he a bad guy? This is how I answer it. Mussolini was a necessity. Fascism in Italy was a necessity. Now, again, I'll go back to Charles Colombo's interpretation of fascism, which is the only place fascism in its truest sense has ever existed is in Italy, right? And it was an idea concocted by Giovanni Gentili, Benito Mussolini, and all the followers of those two individuals, particularly Benito Mussolini. And anything else other than that, whether it is what's going on in Germany at the time with Nazism, or what's going on with Franco in Spain, or Salazar in Portugal, or Dollfuss in Austria, they may be forms of authoritarian governments, but they're not fascism in the same way that it's in Italy. Fascism was purely an Italian idea at the time, and this is how it has to be judged, right? And I would argue, to answer that question, whether Benito was a good guy or a bad guy, Benito was a necessity. And Benito was a necessity for one reason. And one reason I think most Americans won't understand and can't understand, because they haven't lived through it until now, actually. And that is, in Europe at that time, Bolshevik was running rampant for at least 75 years before Americans have to deal with it, right? Because America really doesn't deal with Bolshevism and communism till after the Berlin Wall goes up in the mid-1940s, after World War II ended. But in Europe, they were dealing with it for a long time prior to it. And as we saw in Spain later on, in 1936, you had a civil war breakout because the communists were in Spain in 36. But what most people don't understand is the primary target of the Bolsheviks was Italy first. And Bolsheviks were just piling into Italy as early as the 19-teens, right? 1917, 1918, 1919, right after the First World War. And this was the circumstance that Italians had to deal with at a time. Bolsheviks were brutal. Bolsheviks took over towns. Bolsheviks manipulated markets. Bolsheviks killed people. Bolsheviks were essentially taking over Italy at the time. Now, let's remember what Italy was at the time, before the rise of Benito Mussolini. It was a constitutional monarchy. The problem was it was a weak monarchy. And so you had a situation where Bolsheviks can enter into towns, and effectively the local, I guess, police force or sheriff, whatever you want to call them in Italy, were being overwhelmed. And there was a problem that the monarchy had, because the monarchy had their own military, but in 1919, let's remember, Benito Mussolini declared that there was and again, this is when he was a writer for his newspaper, Il Popolo d'Italia, okay? He declared that there's a Russian army camped out in Italy. The year prior to that, the Kaiser in Germany fell, and the year before that, in 1917, the Tsar of Russia fell under great brutality by the Bolsheviks in that nation. And this is why when we get to World War II, the church is thrown back by these events of what's happening in the world, between this conflict between the Nazis and ultimately the Bolsheviks, and whose side to take on this. Because even the church at the time, it saw the Bolsheviks as the greater problem than the Nazis. And the church has some decisions to make how it was going to deal with both sides of this coin. And so that's why the church fundamentally sides with the fascists, but the church begins to reject the Nazis while still having to deal with them. Again, this is something that many Americans don't understand. Because we are a universal global institution, we have bishops and priests and lay people in all the countries of the world. Politics had to be played. There's nuances in global politics. We just can't separate ourselves as Catholics when we have fellow brothers and sisters in the midst of what is a tyrannical regime. And this is the struggle that the church found itself in. It's a struggle that Italy found itself in as the Bolsheviks are invading in. And a decision had to be made here. Couple that with the fact that Italian democracy, which was imposed after the revolution in 1870s, was notoriously corrupt. Very little got done. Backdoor deals, politicians being bought off, corporations or businesses sort of buying influence. Does that sound familiar? It really never changes anywhere with democracy. You had a situation where Italy was supposed to be Spain about 15 years earlier, but it didn't go down like it did in Spain. It didn't break out in an all-out civil war like in Spain. And why is that? It's because of Benito Mussolini and the rise of fascism. And this is where we get a lot of confusion, where fascism was a necessity, whether you like it or not, as an ideology. And I'll be honest with you, born and raised as an American boy, authoritarian governments scared the living crap out of me. They do. But I also understand nuance, and that not all these ideals of the sort of Anglo-Protestant classical liberal ideology are transferable in every society. You can't do that. It's one of the great mistakes of America, and why America's foreign policy has been an utter disaster for over a century now, because we believe we can import these ideas into every corner of the world. And we see one disaster after another, one bad decision after another by American politicians. But in Italy, a nation that was being consumed by communism, what they already understood, that we're just starting to figure out now, is that the moment you give communists a seat at the table of power, you got a problem. Because communists don't play by the same rules as everybody else. They will lie, they will cheat, they will slander, they will steal election, they will brainwash populations. They'll go after the kids. They'll take over the schools. They'll take over the library. They'll take over the media. They'll get elites to support it. The reality is in many ways, while you see historically tyrannical regimes in communism, their preferred method is actually to use democracy, because they can manipulate and they can again brainwash and steal elections at the end of the day. And this is what we've seen ever since that time. And so in Italy, they had realized, and again, Benito Mussolini was born into a household where his father was a devout Marxist, mother was a devout Catholic, and young Benito, who was very, had a wild side in him, without a doubt, was a young Marxist all the way up until World War I. And when he went and entered into World War I, after the war, Benito began to change, and he began to renounce Marxism because he began to see its flaws. One of the things that Benito saw when he came back from the war was the fact that the socialists and the communists that were taking over Italy at the time were belittling or condemning or mocking, or were what's the word I'm looking for here? Think of American soldiers coming home from Vietnam and the disrespect that they faced. That's what Italian soldiers were receiving in Italy after World War I. And this coming from the socialist Marxist side. And it's what really opened Benito Mussolini's eyes about Marxism. That and the fact that it was an internationalist movement rather than a nationalist movement. And for Benito, a transformation began at that time. Now, some people will say, well, he was born a red diaper doper baby, and therefore he could never be trusted, and that's what he was till his dying day. Maybe you come to that conclusion. But the thing about Benito was always that he was a writer, and he was a very good writer. He was a political thinker. And there's no mystery about who Benito was. He told you exactly what he believed. He was straightforward, just like many Italians are. They'll let you know what they believe. And with Benito, we clearly get a change from his Marxist youth into sort of his fascist youth, right? Or fascist middle age. And then even we see toward the end of his life, a full circle conversion back to the Catholic faith. At least that's what I've seen from my evidence. And I'll cite my sources in the description box here from everything I've read. Now, admittedly, I'm a little hesitant to go on the limb on this because I don't read Italian, okay? Well, okay, I read a little bit of Italian, but when it comes to really those intricate details, I'm at a disadvantage. I have to read English interpretations of what happened in Italy at the time, which leaves me a little bit disadvantaged, but I've read enough now and cross-referenced many sources that I think I got a pretty good picture of what was happening in the early 1920s and 30s. That and the fact that I had family there. My father was born and raised in fascist Italy, along with all of his siblings, all my aunts and uncles. Same with my grandparents on my mother's side. I'm full-blooded Sicilian, and my family was there prior to World War II and during the reign of the fascists. And I can tell you right now, the depictions we've got in the West, in comparison to what I was told by my family, they don't make sense. We have a narrative we have created about fascist Italy in the West because of our Western liberal sensibilities and our allegiance to democracy that doesn't really make sense when you look at what life was like in Italy for most Italians. And while life wasn't pretty for Italians in many ways, mainly because they suffered through a Masonic revolution, they had suffered through World War I, and here comes World War II. The Italian people went through many great tragedies. And in that sense, they had issues to deal with, very difficult issues to deal with. But when fascism rises, you got to remember, unlike from our perspective here in America, fascism in Italy was very popular. Mussolini was very popular. Mussolini does not lose support of the Italian people until World War II starts to go bad, and when Italians start starving. Right? And that's where sort of the stories that I got from my father. My father was born in 1935. He had images. He remembers the hard times of the war, especially after 1941 is when it got really hard for many Sicilians. what I recently found out reading a book by Richard Lamb entitled War in Italy, 1943-1945, A Brutal History, is that while the Southern Italians went through a lot, especially with the invasion of Sicily in 1943, with Montgomery, and I think it was Patton, right? Patton and Montgomery, the two generals, one, of course, of Great Britain and the other of America. The Northern Italians probably went through even something more harsher, and that is the brutality of the Nazis after the king deposed Mussolini as the leader of Italy. But here's the thing. Bolshevism is running rampant all over Italy. And the plan was to make Italy into what had happened in Russia 2 years earlier. That is to take down the heart of the Catholic faith. That is Rome. That is the seat of Peter. That is Italy. That's what the Bolsheviks were targeting. The war veterans came back from World War I after winning in World War I, being on the winning side at least, right? And being disrespected. This led to Benito seeing, okay, it's just the first step of what he began to see as a problem with socialism and Marxism and communism. And that, of course, the corruption and the manipulation of markets and the intimidation that the Bolsheviks were starting to cause havoc. So the question, of course, remains here, what do you do? What do you do? In America, we've given the Bolsheviks, or the communists, I should say, the Marxists in America over the past 75 years, in the name of freedom and liberty, a seat at the table of power. And we've kind of seen how it's worked out for America. We have Americans now scratching their heads saying, what the hell has happened to America? This is the America I know. They've captured all the institutions, right? From the media to the government to the educational system. Well, in Italy, they decided to deal with it in a different kind of way. And that is they literally decided to fight back against it. Whether you believe that's right or wrong, I'll let you judge, right? But that's how they chose to deal with it. And by the end of really Mussolini's March on Rome happens in October 1922. And really by 1926, 1927, the violence is over in Italy. The fascists and Benito Mussolini had pushed the Marxists out. And you found peace in Italy. And you found a fascist system that was much more market-oriented than what the Marxists or the communists were pushing, of course, which was a total takeover of the markets. This is why, again, another thing that conservatives don't understand is that fascists were actually into market economics. They were not central planners like the communists were. You talk about sort of the centralization of power. Yeah, they believed in a strong state. But what was the state in Italy? It was Verona. It was Florence. It was Milan. It was Sicily. It was Rome. It was Bari. That's what the state was. Sure, you had a strong centralized government, but in many ways, it's no different than what was established in America, where the states would have their prerogatives and then the central government would have its prerogatives, right? Now, Mussolini was a true dictator, right? And at times, he had to take dictatorial actions, which in light of history is difficult to read. I'll be the first to tell you. But at the same time, these were difficult times and difficult choices they had to make in Italy. And so I'll let history judge that. Just for my part, I understand why fascism rose and why it had to deal with the circumstances that in the way that it dealt with them, because it understood that Marxists don't play by any rules of justice in any kind of way. And the fascists responded. Now, again, I'll go back to the claim that somehow, well, Benito Mussolini was a red diaper doper baby, and that is what really who he was. He was just another Marxist. Maybe. I think in some capacity, Mussolini was a socialist. He said that toward the end of his life, that he was always a socialist. But you have to understand, you have to take yourself out of the American paradigm. What the Europeans were dealing with at the time, with an invasion of Bolshevism that we're only starting to deal with now in America, is a reality on the ground. And the reality is, in these liberal republics, since the French Revolution, governments have grown and grown and grown and grown, starting first and foremost here in America. And the irony of it all, despite the utopian intentions of the classical liberals to keep government small in America, America has become a giant bureaucratic monster at this point in history. So if we could separate ourselves from the, again, ideological sort of fantasies, if you want to call it that, and deal with reality on the ground, governments were always growing, and governments post-Christendom were always going to grow and take power. The question is, how do you deal with that? How do you preserve that? How are governments going to react to dealing with the growth of government? In Italy, they're more realistic. And one of the reasons why is because Italians have never worshipped at the altar of government in any kind of a way. You don't see Italians thumping, a government document like America, like Constitution. This is God said, this is divine writ. No. Italians have seen every form of government that there is throughout history. We've seen Caesars, we've seen Christian monarchs, we've seen constitutional monarchs, we've seen fascism, we've seen democracy. And what Italians have always known is that governments, they come and they go. What doesn't come and go is culture and faith, which is the heart of Italy, which is the heart of Italians ultimately. Now, how we get there through the nuances of history, because these are scattered sort of providences at the time, sure. But there's one thing all these providences before they're unified in 1870 have in common: the Catholic faith, which is critical in Italy, right? Which, by the way, is a problem that's not solved until Benito Mussolini comes into power. In many ways, you can argue that Benito Mussolini made Italy the modern day Italy. It made Italy Italy because before Benito Mussolini, you had different regions of Italy, different languages, different histories, different traditions. In many ways, even to this day, Southern Italians and Northern Italians don't really like each other all that much. They've come a long way from my understanding from days past. But it was Benito that had to deal with this issue on top of a Bolshevik revolution that was threatening to take over the country. But remember, as the French Revolution had caused havoc throughout all of Europe for the previous century and plus, let's call it that way, and monarchs were falling in a lot of European nations, particularly Catholic nations, the question was, how were these nations going to deal with the infringement of Bolshevik and communist ideology? That was the question, right? In the case of Spain, King Alfonso XIII, I believe, he decided to abdicate the throne, essentially handing the country over to communists. And then, of course, Franco steps in as a military man to capture the country back. And that's what we know, basically, in a nutshell, what the Spanish Revolution was. But in the case of Italy, King Vittorio Emanuele did not surrender the country, though he had a problem at the time that he was trying to deal with. And that is, with the Bolsheviks running all over Italy in the 19-teens, 1917, 1918, 1919, he saw what happened in Russia 2 years earlier. The moment the Russian Tsar mobilized the military, it started a civil war in that country that ended tragically for the monarch. In this case here, as the Bolsheviks are running through Italy and causing havoc, the monarch has a decision to make. Does he or does he not send out his military? The fear was if the king were to send out his military, it would lead to an all-up uprising and revolution in his country, leading effectively to the same thing that happened in Russia 2 years earlier. What does the king do? He turns to Benito Mussolini and the fascists as sort of a private army of sorts, or a private police force that he empowers and hands the government over to. I know a lot of my monarchist friends keep saying, well, we got to forget about fascism. We got to go back to monarchy. But wait a minute. Monarchies turn to fascism. right? In the case of Italy. In the case of Spain, the king abdicated the throne. Now, what were the alliances in Spain? It was the monarchists, it was the integralists, it was the fascists, and it was the church. Those are your alliances, right? And you basically have the same alliances in Italy at the time. This is why you have a relationship between the church and the fascists in Italy. And while the church and the fascists did not agree eye to eye and everything, they had a lot of things in common and they could work together. That, combined with the fact that Mussolini began his conversion to the Catholic faith and understood that Italians are more than just Italians. Italians are Catholics. This is why shock, even when Charles Colomb was on my show at Caster last week, we talked about this, and he kind of said, surprisingly, that question Romana, the issue with the Lateran Accords, which effectively give the Vatican the church lands back to the church, ironically enough, weirdly enough, happened under Benito Mussolini. Now, see, that's interesting because prior to Benito, you had a situation where the church was at odds with the monarchy. The monarchy was kind of liberal. That was part of the issue too. And through the revolution, the church had lost all of its lands, the papal lands and things of that nature. And up until Benito in 1929, the Lateran Accords, remember the church was saying, listen, Italians, or you say Catholics, you Catholics that live in Italy, right? You're not to acknowledge the Italian government. You're not allowed to vote in these elections. The church and state in Italy were at odds with one another, which complicated things in Italy. This doesn't get settled till Benito Mussolini, because Mussolini realized not only were Italians needed to be unified as one, that entire peninsula there, but Italians were Catholics. I mean, when you got a nation that's 95 to 98% Catholic, it's something that's very important to the culture, tradition, history, everything that we have. And it's why fascism in many ways could work in a nation like Italy, because there was another check against this authoritarian government, which is something, again, many Americans don't understand. Because as Americans, we've ousted the church from power. We've accepted this Protestantized personal Jesus, where everybody's an independent God of sorts in many ways. Well, an independent theologian, right? We all get to start our own personal church. But it's a different culture in Italy. This is what has to be understood. And so that's why I say the Italians embraced it for the most part, right? There was always political dissidence, don't get me wrong. There was always, again, we're talking about human institutions with our fallen human nature. And so that fascist regime made many mistakes, without a doubt. But it was working with what it had to work with in order to make Italy whole and protect it from this onslaught of Marxism that was beginning to spread all over the world, right? This is why many Americans, when they tell me, oh, look how liberal Europe is. Yeah, they're only liberal because they had Marxism on their doorstep. America's only been 20 years behind. Look at how we've caught up so fast. You look at a lot of this woke ideology. It may exist in Europe, but it's nothing to the level we're at it now. I mean, we've become completely taken over by Marxism at this point. And I think conservatives have to start thinking about that. So the question here fundamentally is, was Mussolini a good guy or bad guy? I think he was a man that made a lot of bad decisions, a lot of bad mistakes. But ultimately, Benito rose because he had to rise for the Italian people at the time, and for Italy, to protect Italy from this Bolshevik invasion. Later on, we get, of course, to the World War II, and geopolitics is at play. And I would tell you, too, there was nuances there. Benito didn't want to be in alliance with the failed Austrian painter. Trust me, he tried to get out of that alliance. But the Western allies, because they were Western liberal democracies, and they saw Mussolini as a bully because he was an authoritarian leader, they pushed back against him. And it's one of the great disadvantages that Mussolini had, that and the fact that Germany was powerful. Mussolini understood who Hitler was. He understood the military that he built and how strong he was. I'll just say this with his alliance with Hitler, and something to think about, okay? In light of history, Mussolini doesn't sign that pact of steel, which was it 39, I believe, 38, 39, right around there, until Germany had run all through Europe at that time. Germany had gone through France, it had gone through Poland, it had gone through Austria, Denmark, it had gone through Belgium, the Netherlands, everybody. Effectively speaking, Germany had won World War II. Hitler's biggest mistake, going into Russia. That's what cost him. What cost him. And while Mussolini was trying to negotiate with the British and the French at the time, the British particularly pushed back against Mussolini as he tried to get on the Allied side. This is the challenges and the nuances of history. Finally, when the British would not give him final, justification of sorts, or wouldn't allow him into the alliance because of political nuances, particularly because of what happened in Ethiopia, there wasn't much of a choice left for Benito but to join Hitler. The question is, could he have just stayed out of that alliance? That's the question, right? It's a difficult one. He needed to, and that was one of his great mistakes. But again, fascism rise in Italy because it had to rise. Mussolini, despite his mistakes, was he a good guy or bad guy? Well, you judge from what I've told you. That's all I can say. I think he was clearly a fallen man. I think he clearly made a lot of mistakes. But there was a side of Benito, and you still hear it today in Italy, by a lot of people saying that he did what he had to do and what was in the best interest of Italy at the time. And in many ways, he made Italy. Let's be honest. Because since its democratic, what do you want to call it, runnings, or, its venture into democracy, Italy's been a basket case. Let's be honest. It has. But then again, what Western nation has it? That's why I say we keep tilting further and further to the left. I know we Americans believe our Constitution is superior to everybody else's. The fact is, we've been going to the left with the rest of the world, including the rest of Europe, post-World War II, where I believe really what it was the last nail in the coffin of Christendom. As a result, we've seen what liberalism has done to the world over the past 80 years. It hasn't been good. Marxism won. Communism won. And we're all living through that today. Despite what you may think of Benito, there was one side of him, at least one side of him, that fought a very valiant war that should be reconsidered in light of history. But I get it. He joined the failed Austrian painter, and history will never forgive him for that. And maybe rightfully so. But I choose to look at history in a little bit more nuanced way. So that's just some simple information there that I've given you, what I've read, what I've studied. You can take it for what it's worth. Look it up. I'll put some resources in the comment section. I want to thank you for joining me tonight. This is Frank, signing off for Frankly Speaking. Good night, everybody.